And I remember him sauntering up to the front and not giving us a lecture, but engaging us in a conversation and speaking the truth.
Obama is very interested during the Reagan era, the 1980s, about how you recreate a movement for social justice. Benjamin Netanyahu comes of age politically in the United States during the Reagan era, at a time when the American organized Jewish community is undergoing a transformation.
The real core of the conflict is the unfortunate Arab refusal to accept the state of Israel. For 20 years, the Arabs had both the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And if self-determination were, as they now say, the core of the conflict, they could have easily established a Palestinian state then.
Obama came into office with the belief that if America was not actively engaged diplomatically with the Israel-Palestine question, very bad things would happen. They faced a Netanyahu government that was fundamentally hostile and really had very little confidence or interest in any short-term negotiations towards a Palestinian state.
We both agreed that a peace based on illusions will crash eventually on the rocks of Middle Eastern reality.
Obama does see himself as being pro-Israel, but his image of what it means to be pro-Israel is shaped by the progressive Jews that he knows in Chicago. Part of this Jewish circle is Hyde Park, which is a community which is in many ways quite like Harvard Law Review. It's racially integrated, it's academic, it's politically progressive. At the center of the Jewish community that influenced Obama is Rabbi Arnold Jacob Wolf. Arnold Wolf was the private secretary to Abraham Joshua Heschel, the figure who in mid-20th century America most embodied the idea that Jews were heir to a prophetic tradition that they had to live out through the struggles for civil rights, against the Vietnam War, against McCarthyism.
God is either the father of all men or of no men. And the idea of judging a person in terms of black or brown or white is an eye disease.
Wolf tried to embody that same ethos in Chicago, and many of his congregants were people who became Obama's professional mentors, and I think shaped the way Obama saw Jews, the Jewish tradition, and Israel. Obama naturally gravitates towards the idea that the Jewish tradition has a universal ethical message, which is about the idea that suffering is universal and that people who have suffered have an obligation to help those who are suffering today. There are many others in the Jewish community who are uncomfortable with that universalistic a message and are more likely to stress the story of the oppression of Jews, which is recurring throughout history. Benjamin Netanyahu grew up not only in a deeply Zionist home, but in a deeply revisionist home. His father, Ben-Zion Netanyahu, is a revisionist who believes that part of the reason he couldn't get an academic job in Israel was because he was persecuted by the labor establishment. Ben-Zion Netanyahu had been briefly the private secretary to Vladimir Jabotinsky, leader of revisionist Zionism. What makes Jabotinsky different than the labor Zionist is the emphasis he places on militarism. The other difference is the absolute opposition to territorial compromise. With the first Likud prime minister, Menachem Begin, he dramatically expands settlement building.
The people of Israel, the Jewish people, are an eternal people, and their lot and future are not dependent on a political meeting with the leader of the free world.
On the other hand, he does make a territorial compromise, giving away the Sinai in return for peace with Egypt. Netanyahu's father, Ben-Zion Netanyahu, bitterly attacked Begin for that concession. So the pragmatism that a Likud government in power actually did succumb to was never really accepted in the Netanyahu family. Benjamin Netanyahu, his fundamental set of core beliefs have not changed significantly. He ran for election as Prime Minister of Israel as someone who would not say he was for a Palestinian state, and he created a government without saying that the premise of that government would be the support of a Palestinian state.
I cannot be a partner to a move that I think compromises the security of Israel, tears the people apart, and enshrines the principle of withdrawal to the indefensible 67 lines, and I think in the future will also risk the unity of Jerusalem.
You had Obama saying, we want a settlement freeze because we want to strengthen the Palestinians who've shown themselves committed to nonviolence. You had an Israeli government that thought that the settlement issue and the entire Palestinian issue was essentially secondary, and who wanted to focus on Iran, and whose own political constituency was significantly composed of people who were either settlers themselves or highly sympathetic to the settlement process. Then the Palestinians ramp up the pressure in the fall of 2011 by going to the United Nations and asking the United Nations to recognize a Palestinian state. Obama, he tries to derail this by getting the Palestinians and the Israelis back to negotiations along the parameters of the 67 borders plus swaps.
A lasting peace will involve two states for two peoples. We believe the borders of Israel and Palestine should be based on the 1967 lines with mutually agreed swaps.
What Obama hopes is that the Israelis will accept those parameters because it will help the United States. Instead, Netanyahu comes to Washington and very publicly and aggressively rejects the idea of negotiations based on the 67 borders plus swaps.
I think for there to be peace, the Palestinians will have to accept some basic realities. The first is that while Israel is prepared to make generous compromises for peace, it cannot go back to the 1967 lines.
Eric Cantor, the incoming House Majority Leader, meets with Benjamin Netanyahu and says publicly, Congress will serve as a check on the Obama administration when it comes to Israel. And that, in fact, is exactly what they do. And that's the triumph of Netanyahu's visit, that he's able to mobilize sympathetic members of Congress and the organized American Jewish community to produce a very vociferous response to Obama's call for negotiations based on the 67 parameters plus swaps, such that Obama cannot put any pressure on Netanyahu to go along with that, and ultimately has to retreat and allow the peace process essentially to wither.
You don't need to export democracy to Israel. We've already got it. And you don't need to send American troops to Israel. We defend ourselves.
Starting in 2011, Obama moves into election mode in which he stops being willing to use any domestic political capital in order to push towards negotiations.
Since my position has been misrepresented several times, let me reaffirm what 1967 lines with mutually agreed swaps means. By definition, it means that the parties themselves, Israelis and Palestinians, will negotiate a border that is different than the one that existed on June 4th, 1967. That's what mutually agreed upon swaps means.
Obama lost this struggle over settlements and over the peace process with Netanyahu. The striking thing about the 2012 debate is that that struggle is not even on the agenda, really. Now we're only doing Iran. The dominant topic of conversation is the topic Netanyahu wanted to be dominant from the beginning. And now the question is whether Netanyahu can push Obama into a position in which Obama may be more supportive of an Israeli or American military attack than perhaps he might otherwise be inclined to be. I think it would take those American Jews who believe that being pro-Israel means fidelity to the principles in Israel's Declaration of Independence, which calls for complete equality of social and political rights irrespective of race, religion, and sex. It would require them to advocate for that vision of being pro-Israel in a much, much more aggressive way than they have before, such that a president like Barack Obama could do what I think he believes is in the interest of Israel, which is trying to return Israel to a country that offers the right of citizenship to all people under its domain, irrespective of race, religion, and sex, as its own founding document calls for.